Welcome to the debate. So if you exaggerate the load-bearing capacity of steel on a suspension bridge, people get hurt.
Right. Catastrophic failure.
Exactly. An engineer doesn't just look at a cable and label it high-capacity structural steel just because it sounds really impressive on the engineering firm's brochure. They assign that label based on a very precise metallurgy report that dictates exactly how much stress that specific cable can withstand under pressure.
I see where you're going with this. But what happens when we try to apply that exact same rigid structural engineering mindset to human capital?
I'd argue it's necessary.
Well, but if we walk into a complex professional environment, right, like a corporate merger or a hospital ward, or maybe a startup that's pivoting its entire product line, that strict engineering metaphor starts to buckle. Human value isn't poured in a foundry, It is fluid, it's contextual, and it is highly collaborative.
Which brings us to the very heart of what we are parsing out today. We're looking at how we govern professional claims when building a documented living professional record, or LPR.
Right, the LPR framework.
Yeah, and specifically, we are examining the critical role of ownership verbs. So the central question is this: does strict adherence to a rigid taxonomy of these verbs, words like owned, led, managed, and coordinated, act as the ultimate necessary safeguard for professional truth?
Or as on the flip side, does this hyper-focus on rigid categories risk obscuring the nuanced reality of a worker's actual value?
I argue that strict taxonomic alignment of verbs to documented evidence is the paramount control mechanism we have. It's how we prevent overclaiming, protect the job market from credential inflation, and ultimately protect the worker from being exposed in a tough interview.
And I argue that while accuracy is obviously non-negotiable, an overly rigid application of these discrete verb categories actually damages the worker by forcing a client's complex collaborative reality into a small set of predefined boxes. You inadvertently lead to underclaiming. You fail to capture the full contextual value of the work they actually delivered.
Let's ground this in the mechanics of how a professional record is actually built, all right? Because when an advisor sits down with a client to map out their evidence, the ownership verb is one of the strongest claim controls available, period.
It is definitely a powerful lever, yeah.
It is. And the rule is incredibly straightforward here. The advisor should not choose the verb that sounds most powerful. They shouldn't just grab a word because it looks great on a resume.
Right, no keyword stuffing.
Exactly. The advisor should choose the verb that matches the evidence, because this taxonomy isn't just some grammar lesson. It's a risk management tool.
Well, and the hierarchy of those verbs is what we really need to dissect here, because the definitions are extremely specific.
They matter immensely. So let's walk through the definitive LPR taxonomy. First, you have owned. That means primary responsibility and authority. The buck stopped with them.
Total accountability.
Right. Then you have led, which means they directed work, people, process, or effort. Below that is managed. Managed means they controlled workflow, team, resources, timeline, or process.
Which is a very specific type of control.
Very specific. Then we move to coordinated. That means they align people, information, schedules, handoffs, or work streams. Then down to supported, which just means they contributed to a larger effort.
Just a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And finally, observed, meaning the client saw or participated, but did not own the work in any capacity. So the bottom line is that the strongest verb is the most accurate defensible verb. It acts as a hard boundary to ensure the claim doesn't outrun its source material.
I absolutely agree that words have definitions, and we cannot let clients inflate their reality. But professional reality in the modern corporate world rarely fits neatly into those discrete engineering-style buckets.
The buckets cover pretty much every level of authority.
On paper, maybe, but my primary concern is the other side of the risk equation, which is underclaiming. When an advisor hyperfixates on finding a mathematically safe, lower-tier verb like supported or coordinated, they can trigger a massive erasure of what actually happened on the ground.
How so? Because if the evidence says they supported it, then they supported it.
Because clients constantly self-minimize. We see this all the time. A client sits across from you and says, "Oh, I just helped," or "I was not the official manager," or "It was really just a big team effort."
Right, imposter syndrome is real.
Exactly. And if we strictly follow the taxonomy without questioning the operational reality, we just tag them with "support it." We stamp it and move on. But true accuracy comes not just from a localized verb, but from identifying the underlying dynamic of the work. If we worship the taxonomy, we miss the totality of professional truth.
Wait, let me stop you there, because I think we need to look at how these verbs function mechanically before we just dismiss them as rudimentary. I want you to think about the evidence-to-claim gap.
Okay?
That is the primary danger we are guarding against here. When you use a word like lead, you are making a structural promise to the market. You are telling a future employer exactly who held the bag when things went wrong.
Sure, accountability is key.
Right. So let's look at the reality of informal leadership. Because I know this is a space where a lot of advisors feel the taxonomy is, well, too harsh.
It is incredibly harsh. I'd say it's probably the #1 source of friction in building a professional record.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that friction. A client might feel they showed immense leadership during a crisis, right? Maybe they provided critical decision support, or they maintained team continuity when a massive project was just going completely off the rails.
Which is incredibly valuable.
It is valuable, but if they did not have formal authority, if they did not actively direct the people, the budget, or the process, labeling that as led or managed is overclaiming.
I disagree.
It doesn't matter how they felt about their contribution. Verbs are like the load-bearing beams of a claim. You cannot build a massive public claim on a supported foundation. Without the formal direction of resources, using those words creates an unsafe claim.
See, that is exactly where the taxonomy becomes a straitjacket rather than a safeguard. Modern work is fundamentally collaborative. Matrixed organizations basically run entirely on informal leadership.
But informal leadership isn't formal authority. It just isn't.
No, but it is a real, documentable contribution that goes way beyond simply supporting. Think about a senior individual contributor in a massive, sprawling corporate division.
Okay.
They have 0 direct reports. They control absolutely no budget. Yet they are the one providing the crucial stakeholder communication, the risk reduction, and the operational visibility that literally keeps a failing enterprise project alive.
Right.
According to your strict interpretation of the taxonomy, they didn't lead or manage or own anything. They merely coordinated or supported.
Which technically matches their structural authority.
Yes, but technically matching the dictionary definition and capturing the professional truth are two very different things. Functionally, calling that person a supporter completely fails the test of accuracy. It minimizes their impact.
I hear you.
If you're an advisor listening to this, you've probably felt this exact friction. You have a client sitting across from you who clearly saved a multi-million-dollar project, and telling them they only supported it feels like an insult. By forcing complex, informal authority into a low-tier verb bucket simply because it's safe, we are actively participating in underclaiming.
Look, I understand the instinct to want to reward the client for their outsized impact. I really do. But forcing them into supported doesn't erase their value if we build the rest of the claim correctly. The verb protects the client from exposure.
I just don't see how minimizing them protects them.
Let me give you a very tangible example of why this rigidity is required. Let's talk about the AI boom that is currently, frankly, plaguing the job market with inflated credentials.
Oh yeah, let's definitely look at AI. It's a mess out there.
It really is. So, say a client completes a basic introductory AI certificate online. That is the raw evidence. The only claim that credential supports is completed introductory AI training.
Right, very cut and dry.
Right. Or perhaps, if we stretch it slightly, it supports an emerging claim of developing AI literacy. It absolutely does not support the claim AI strategy leader.
Of course not.
But what happens in the real world? The client uses their informal influence. Maybe they just showed their team how to use a new AI text tool, and suddenly they reach for the word leader on their record. They stretch the wording because it feels true to them.
Which is clear credential inflation.
Exactly. And the strict verb scale prevents it. The verb is a hard stop. It asks, does the documented record actually support the level of this word? If the answer is no, you move down the taxonomy.
Because you don't want them getting crushed in the interview.
Yes. Picture what happens. The hiring manager says, so, I see here you led our AI strategy. Walk me through how you manage the budget and the enterprise deployment.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario.
The client freezes because they didn't manage a budget. They just took a course and showed their friends a cool prompt. The evidence to claim gap swallows them whole. The rigid verb saves them from that humiliation.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that context dynamically scales a claim independently of the verb? I mean, I don't disagree with the AI example because that is a clear-cut case of just lacking evidence entirely.
Okay, so where do we diverge?
Well, the source material explicitly states that context changes the claim. It doesn't just decorate it, it changes it fundamentally.
But how does context change the underlying action, though? I mean, the action is the action.
Let me give you the checklist example. Let's say the core action is simply created a checklist.
Sure.
If the context is that this checklist was just for personal use at their desk, the supported claim is just organized own workflow. Very basic.
Yep, very low level.
But what if that exact same checklist is adapted across 3 different office locations during a period of intense, high turnover, and it gets regional manager feedback, and it actually becomes the standard operating procedure for the whole region?
Okay, that's a big shift in impact.
Exactly. The physical action hasn't changed at all. The literal verb is still rooted in making a list. But the context elevates the claim massively. It becomes a coordinated adoption of onboarding checklist across 3 locations to improve first-week consistency.
Right.
My argument is that it is the context, the operational texture, the environment, the turnover, the scale, that does the heavy lifting in establishing the true strength of the claim. It's not about fixating on whether we use coordinated versus managed.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because look at your own example. You still ended up using the word coordinated. Well, sure, but even with all of that incredible, expansive context, the 3 locations, the high turnover, the executive feedback, what verb did you actually arrive at? You didn't say owned company onboarding. You didn't say transformed enterprise talent operations.
Because that would be fiction.
Exactly. Because those would be unsafe claims. No matter how much brilliant context you inject into it, the verb must remain tethered to the reality of the client's authority.
I'm not saying we should lie.
But the strict taxonomy is what prevented you from inflating the claim to led HR strategy. The verb is what prevents the claim from becoming an overreach that has to be flagged and hidden from public view. The context adds the flavor in the scale? Absolutely. But the verb is the unshakable foundation that stops the whole structure from drifting into fantasy.
Okay, I think we need a better metaphor here. Because context isn't just flavor. It's not just a garnish. Context is the muscle.
The muscle?
Yeah, think of the verb as the skeletal structure and the value pattern, the context, as the muscle. The muscle shows how strong you are, how much weight you can lift, and how you interact with your environment.
But a skeleton has to support the muscle.
Yes, if the skeletal structure is misaligned, the whole body breaks under pressure. I agree with that. But if you only look at a skeleton, you have absolutely no idea how powerful the person actually was. We have to move beyond these discrete verbs to what the curriculum calls value patterns.
But value patterns still rely on the verbs, don't they?
They rely on them, but they surpass them. A value pattern isn't a job title, and it isn't a generic verb. It is a recurring way the client's work actually creates value in the real world.
Give me an example of what you mean.
So instead of arguing endlessly over whether someone officially led or merely coordinated a project, we look at the evidence and find the pattern. Instead of labeling someone a generic leader, which is a pretty weak claim anyway, we find the true pattern, like stabilizes teams during unclear or high-pressure operating conditions.
Okay, I see the appeal of that phrasing.
Or clarifies complex information so cross-functional teams can act consistently. Those patterns are vastly more truthful and vastly more protective of market trust than picking a single word from a rigid taxonomy. The verb taxonomy is just a rudimentary stepping stone to get to the muscle.
Look, value patterns are essential. I will never dispute that. But they do not replace the skeleton. You can't just have a pile of muscle without the bones.
That's a bit of an exaggeration of my point.
But let's look at what happens when we take all this internal data and finally translate it for the outside job market. This is Toolkit 3.5. When we move into market translation, we have to ask, what does the outside world call this evidence-backed value?
Right, translating it for HR.
Yeah, and when we classify a worker's market readiness, whether they are a direct fit for a job, an adjacent fit, or if they need a bridge to get there, the original ownership verb is the ultimate determinant of their lane.
I completely disagree that it's the ultimate determinant in translation.
It has to be. If a client wants to transition into a formal project management role, but their documented evidence only supports the verbs supported or observed, they are fundamentally lacking the required proof.
In a literal sense, sure.
They cannot claim they are a direct fit for a project manager job. They have a proof gap. They must go back into the field and build proof, take on a project, gain applied practice, earn the authority before they can claim that capability.
But if we blur the verbs and just focus on these beautiful high-level value patterns you're talking about, we give clients a false sense of readiness. The rigid verb tells the advisor exactly how mature the claim is and whether the client is actually ready for the market.
Let's explore that translation phase, though, because I come at it from a different way. This is exactly where the rigidity of the taxonomy breaks down completely. Market translation requires a much more holistic lens than literal verbs allow.
How so? Translation is about accuracy.
Take the classic example of a military veteran transitioning into civilian corporate operations.
Okay, that is a great example, right? Because their military record is going to be filled with literal verbs that either do not exist in civilian HR systems or map incredibly poorly to them. Words like commanded or highly specific tactical verbs about munitions and deployments.
Yes, the vocabulary is totally different.
If an advisor sticks strictly to a literal translation of those original ownership verbs, they might falsely downgrade this veteran's massive logistical capability. They might say, well, you didn't officially manage a civilian P&L spreadsheet, so your verbs don't align. You're just a supporter in the corporate world.
But that's a failure of the advisor, not the taxonomy.
It's a failure of rigid mapping. In an adjacent fit translation, we have to look at the holistic evidence. We see a value pattern of, say, reducing risk and clarifying handoffs in high-stakes environments.
Right.
Finding the closest responsible language in the civilian market requires us to flex beyond the strict literal verb they held in the military. If we rely solely on the literal verb, we underclaim their capability. We fail to serve the veteran, and honestly, we fail the civilian market that desperately needs their logistical skills.
That military example is fascinating, but I think it actually highlights exactly why the discipline of the verb is so necessary to protect everyone involved. You are talking about translation, and translation is a highly valid process.
Yes, it's essential.
But translation is not invention. Even when we are translating military experience into an adjacent civilian role, the structural authority must match.
What do you mean?
If the military officer commanded a large supply unit, the equivalent civilian verb might be directed or managed. We are still mapping to a specific equivalent level of authority.
Yes, if they commanded a unit.
Right. But if they were a logistics clerk who simply tracked the inventory on a clipboard, their civilian equivalent is maintained or coordinated. They didn't lead the global supply chain.
Of course not.
The translation changes the vocabulary to match the corporate market, but it must never elevate the structural authority of the verb. If we abandon that strict mapping, an advisor might translate a military logistics clerk into a civilian operations director simply because they operated in a high-stakes, life-or-death value pattern.
No advisor would do that.
But they could, without the verb as a guardrail. That is overclaiming. That sets the veteran up for absolute failure in a civilian interview. It creates a massive credibility problem, which is exactly what our claim governance rules are designed to prevent.
But you are assuming the rigid taxonomy is the only way to prevent that invention. I argue that the rigor of identifying proof gaps and testing what we call positioning hypotheses does that work far more effectively.
Okay, explain what you mean by that. How is a hypothesis better than a rule?
A positioning hypothesis is a testable statement. It explicitly says, I may be well positioned for this role because my record shows this evidence pattern producing this value pattern.
Okay.
It's a direction to test in the market. It's not a final identity claim carved in stone. When we test that hypothesis with actual networking or market feedback, the market will quickly tell us if there is a proof gap.
But why test a gap you already know is there?
Because we don't need to artificially compress a worker's complex reality into supported on day one just out of fear that they might overclaim later. We let the hypothesis test the waters. If we start by minimizing them with a low-tier verb, we never even formulate the bold hypothesis that could lead them to a well-earned adjacent fit role. Underclaiming is just as much of a violation of a truthful record as overclaiming is.
Well, we are in total agreement that underclaiming is a violation. The guiding principle is clear. Do not overclaim, do not underclaim. But how do we actually define underclaiming?
It's erasing their impact.
Right. It is when a client's real contribution is hidden, minimized, or erased. It's when a client says, I just updated spreadsheets, when in reality, the entire executive team relied on that spreadsheet for operational visibility and decision support.
Exactly. So we have to capture that visibility.
Application of it. If they provided decision support, the accurate claim is maintained a tracking structure that enabled executive decisions. They still didn't lead the project, they maintained it.
That still feels overly constrained.
The discipline of the verb forces the advisor to be highly specific about what the mechanical contribution actually was, rather than throwing their hands up and saying, well, the context was really complex and they saved the day, so let's just call them a leader.
But no one is advocating for throwing our hands up and assigning unearned titles. What I am advocating for is recognizing that professional truth is not a single isolated data point on a grid. It is an ecosystem.
An ecosystem built on facts.
Yes, but look at how claims mature. A claim can be labeled internally as supported with caution, or emerging, or context-dependent. These governance labels exist precisely because evidence is rarely as clean as a broken bone on an X-ray.
True. Evidence can be messy.
Right. So if someone has an emerging capability, meaning they are right on the cusp of leading, and they are doing the work of a leader informally, forcing a rigid historical verb onto them anchors them in the past. It might prevent them from capturing the forward-looking trajectory of their career. We have to balance the defensible verb against the broader value patterns to truly prepare a professional's record for the public eye.
And that preparation for the public eye is exactly why my position holds firm. If an advisor sends poorly governed, loosely defined claims out into the job market, the final product becomes what we call polished fiction.
Which nobody wants.
Exactly. The core doctrine we must return to is this: do not make the claim bigger, make the claim truer.
I agree with that completely.
And making a claim truer must absolutely begin with the precise, disciplined selection of the ownership verb. It is the architectural anchor. It ensures that whether a claim is fully verified, emerging, or still private, it remains tethered to a verifiable reality. Without that strict taxonomic alignment, the entire structure of trust between the worker and the market collapses under the weight of subjective interpretation.
And I will summarize by saying that while protecting trust is absolutely paramount, true accuracy requires more than just matching words to a dictionary definition. It requires balancing that defensible verb against the expansive operational reality of the worker.
A delicate balance for sure.
It really is. A strict verb taxonomy is a tool. It's a highly useful, necessary tool, but it is not the totality of professional truth. If we use it as a blunt instrument, we risk underclaiming. We risk erasing the vital, informal, and contextual contributions that make professionals truly valuable in complex environments. To protect trust in the market, we must not only prevent fiction, we must fully illuminate the complex truth.
Well, we certainly agree that a claim itself is not proof, and that every claim must ultimately answer to the documented record. The complexity of governing these claims is profound. It requires navigating the rigid, unforgiving boundaries of empirical evidence while simultaneously understanding the fluid, expansive nature of human value.
It is a massive responsibility for any advisor. It's a delicate balance to strike before any claim sees the light of day in a public job application or an interview.
It is. We started today by talking about the engineering of a suspension bridge and the rigid math required to label a steel cable. A beautifully painted bridge that collapses under its own weight because the materials were exaggerated helps no one.
Right. The hiring manager feels duped and the worker falls.
Exactly. But on the flip side, a bridge engineered to hold 1,000 tons, which is artificially labeled with a pedestrians-only sign out of an abundance of caution, is a tragedy of unutilized potential. Deciding which mechanism, the strict skeletal boundary of the verb, or the holistic muscular context of the pattern, is the ultimate protector of that bridge is a question every advisor will have to answer for themselves. Thank you for listening. We will see you next time.